All right, we're back for part 2 of chapter 16, and we left off talking about cyber vandalism. And remember, we kind of started this conversation on cybercrime basically talking about, you know, cybercrime itself. We talked about cyber theft, computer crime, theft of information, different things like that. We talked about identity theft, some fraud schemes like phishing, and now we're going to talk a little bit about cyber vandalism. And, some cyber criminals, again, may be motivated not by greed or profit, as we kind of left off talking about, but for, let's say, revenge, the desire to inflict some type of injury, if you will, or destruction on the other end. So cyber vandalism includes the introduction of things like viruses and worms, maybe web defacement, denial of service attacks, and again, the rationale that they do this would be the desire to exhibit their power or superiority, to highlight the vulnerability of security systems, to spy on other people, or basically destroy security because they believe in open access. So just really quickly, let's talk about each one. So virus and worms. A computer virus is one type of malicious software program called malware, which you've probably heard that term before, that disrupts or destroys existing programs and networks, causing them to perform instead of the task for which the virus was designed. So the virus is then spread from one computer to another when a user sends out an infected file, through email, a network, or portable media, etc. Now, Trojan horses, some hackers may introduce what they call a Trojan horse program into a system. And the Trojan horse looks like kind of a benign application, but it contains illicit codes that can damage the system operations. And sometimes hackers, with a kind of cruel sense of irony, install this Trojan horse and claim that it's an antivirus program when actually it's not. Denial of service attack. This is where users of an internet service are prevented from access to that service. So cyber criminals who use this technology may attempt to extort money from the service provider, which could be a bank, credit card company, or something else, in exchange for stopping the attack. And the picture on the right, there was one of the largest fuel companies in the United States, the Colonial Pipeline, was basically victim of a denial of service attack where they wanted a certain amount of money before they would put the fuel pumping station back online, if you will. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic in the way they use this. Web defacement may be where cyber vandals target websites as their victims, okay? And they may deface the website, substituting different codes, misleading information, etc. And then finally, we have cyber stalking. Now, traditional stalking involves repeated harassing or threatening behavior, like following a person, appearing at a person's home or place of business, making harassing phone calls, leaving messages or objects, or even vandalizing property. Cyber stalking is through the use of the internet, email, or other electronic device, right? Or electronic communication device or system to stalk that person. And some cyber stalkers pursue individuals in online chat rooms, etc. So that's more of the definition of cyber stalking. Okay, and then a couple of other kinds. We talked about cyber stalking, via chat rooms, etc., things like that. Cyberbullying. So experts define bullying among children as repeated negative acts committed by one or more children against another. And it includes things like harassing emails or instant messages, obscene, insulting or slanderous messages online, in bulletin boards, etc. Websites promoting and disseminating defamatory content, even harassing text messages. So we have to kind of, we know with the advent of the internet, there's just so much more that people can get away with. And because of the availability of cyberspace, physical distance really isn't, kind of a refuge from frequent, cyber or from bullying, right? Because the internet can get anywhere. So cyberbullying, again, is the willful and repeated harm inflicted through the use of an electronic device, typically a text. And like their real world counterparts, cyberbullies are malicious and cowardly aggressors who seek kind of pleasure or profit through the mistreatment of other people. And although power in traditional bullying might derive from physical stature or social popularity, advantage, online power may simply stem from proficiency using the net. So cyber bullies who are able to navigate the internet and utilize the technology in a way that enables them to harass somebody are in a position of power relative to their victim, right? And there's 4 major approaches that cyber bullies employ to basically harass their victims. And I kind of covered them already, but just as a rehash, harassing emails or instant messages, obscene, insulting, slanderous, messages on social media. They can develop websites to promote or disseminate, slanderous content, or even, harassing text messages. So, and it's really difficult to prove a lot of times too. And when you look at the amount of people that use these different things, so here is a chart that shows the percentage of individuals that use social media on a daily basis. You can see, which one of these is used most often. Okay, typically Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, things like that. And then where are people cyberbullied? Maybe a little bit different. So we have Instagram first, Facebook, Snapchat, and then a couple of other things down there. So just for your information. And then we get into some other areas that are, kind of a little bit higher tech, I guess. So cyber warfare. So the justice system must now also be on guard against attacks of cyber warfare that are aimed at the United States by overseas adversaries. And although sometimes hard to define, cyber warfare can be viewed as an effort by covert forces to disrupt the points where the virtual electronic reality of computers intersects with, the physical world, if you will. So cyber warfare, by definition, politically motivated attacks designed to compromise the electronic infrastructure of an enemy nation and disrupt its economy. So, again, even though they may come from a region where computer databases and the internet are not widely used, terrorist organizations are now beginning to understand the damage that cybercrime can inflict on their targets. And terrorist organizations are now adapting, information technology into their arsenal, and agencies of the justice system have to be ready for a sustained attack on the nation's electronic infrastructure. So again, it's just, we have to be kind of on our guard on a bunch of different aspects, if you will. And one form of this type of attack, if you will, is what we call espionage or cyber espionage. And this involves hacking into secure computer networks at the target's, nation's most sensitive military bases, defense contractors, and aerospace companies in order to steal data or to basically kind of assess their defenses. And infrastructure attacks can include things like water treatment plants, electrical plants, dams, oil refineries, nuclear power plants, and even fuel depots or fuel, manufacturing plants like we looked at back here. Although this was a denial of service attack, but it doesn't mean it couldn't have happened the other way. So with that said, what's the extent then of, cybercrime? Well, there's thousands of breaches each year. Okay, we already know that. And the internet has become a major source of illegal profits. And it's billions of dollars. And a lot of it isn't reported to authorities. Now, there's a report that comes out that actually came out from the FBI, the 2020 Internet Crime Report, that you could take a look at, and it'll give you some more of that information. But we know really that the profit is enormous. It continues to grow, and losses are now in the billions of dollars. And they continue to rise with, continuing growth of e-commerce and things like that. So how do we control it? Well, the proliferation of cyber crimes has created the need for some new laws and enforcement processes. And because, this technology evolves so rapidly, enforcement presents challenges that are particularly difficult, right? Numerous organizations have been kind of set up to provide training and support for law enforcement personnel. In addition, new federal and state laws have been aimed at particular areas of high-tech crimes. Well, what are some of the legislative initiatives that we're talking about? Well, it could be, software piracy laws. It could be copyright infringement. Identity theft, which is really one of the more difficult things to control. Internet pornography, and computer crimes. So there's a lot of new legislative initiatives as it relates to each one of these different areas. And how do we enforce it, though? So we've got some of this information. So how has the justice system responded to cybercrime, and how do we enforce it? Well, most of the efforts are being made at the federal level, and one approach is to create working groups that coordinate the activities of numerous federal agencies involved in investigating cybercrime. And another is to team up federal agencies with state and local partners. For example, New York, there's a kind of a New York, New Jersey electronic crimes task force, if you will, and they are there to deal with certain types of cybercrime, et cetera. So we have, the federal level, we have Internet Fraud Complaint Center, we have the National White Collar Crime Center, and you can even go to the Internet Crime Complaint Center here for the FBI. So there are some specialized agencies. One specialized enforcement agency, again, is the FBI, and they typically work a lot of these different types of crimes. Okay, so now we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit, and we're going to finish up with transnational organized crime, and then we'll jump into terrorism, and then we'll be done. So, when it comes to, organized crime, if you will, a major threat involves what we call this transnational organized crime, which is basically an ongoing international criminal enterprise whose group's goal is basically personal economic gain through illegitimate means. Okay, and though sophisticated in the use of technology for communication and recruitment, these criminal groups have also used kind of systematic violence and corruption to achieve their goals, if you will. And they're involved in a lot of different things like money laundering, human smuggling, cybercrime, trafficking of humans, drugs, weapons, endangered species, body parts, or even nuclear material. And it's kind of interesting because a lot of these transnational crime networks may locate themselves in nations whose governments are basically too weak to prevent or present any kind of effective opposition. If they believe that the government may be interfering with their illegal activities that bring them, immense profits, such as drug trafficking, then they'll carry out a terror campaign there, killing police officials, using bribery, violence, or terror to basically achieve their goals. And here's kind of a little chart that shows you how money laundering typically works, the different stages of money laundering. So how are some of these things kind of dealt with? And if you go back, and we just don't have time to go through them all, but if you go back to page 637 and 638, it lists a couple of the different groups, okay, that are involved in some of these. And we're going to kind of keep this generic and just know what the definition of these transnational organized crime groups are, but they go through each one, like the Yakuza, the triads, some different Russian groups, etc. So you can see some of those on your, in your textbook. So in controlling this transnational crime, we have things like our groups, the Eurasian Organized Crime Working Group, the Central European Working Group, the Southeast European Cooperative Initiative, and then we also have the Racketeer Influence and Corruption Organization Act. And this is basically what we call a RICO Act. And RICO is basically federal legislation that enables prosecutors to bring about additional criminal or civil charges against people engaged in 2 or more acts prohibited by 24 existing federal and 8 state laws. And typically you'll see that in narcotics type organizations. Okay. So, RICO is designed basically for, things like extortion, bribery, arson, gambling, robbery, narcotics, those types of crimes. And there are a variety of transnational gangs whose membership is spread across the globe. Chinese groups are heavily involved in human trafficking. Eastern gangs trace their origin to the Balkans, Central Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, trading in illegal arms, narcotics, pornography, and prostitution. Romania, the Ukraine, Bosnia, all of these are being impacted by this transnational crime. Mexican cartels that you might basically know a little bit more about, or you've probably heard about it, have become the large-scale suppliers of narcotics, marijuana, methamphetamine to the U.S. And Mexico has become kind of a drug-producing and transit country. In addition, about 90% of cocaine entering the United States travels through Mexico, which kind of creates the battle for the border, right? Not necessarily for illegal immigration, but more for how do you stop all of the drugs coming up through Mexico. And that can be extremely difficult, right? So there's numerous cartels that are located in Mexico. And you can look on page 640 in your textbook, and it kind of shows you some of the different drug routes and organized crime groups and where they're at. But when it comes to cartels operating in Mexico, you have the Gulf, Tijuana, Sinaloa, Juarez, Millennium, Oaxaca, Colima, and Las Citas. So these are all, and you can see here, these are wanted flyers for some of the different cartel individuals. And here's that chart I was talking about on page 640 that gives you, the area of operation. So the kind of pink is the Sinaloa, okay? And here you have the Tierra Caliente in kind of the blue area down here, and then the green. And then you have the different drug routes that are coming in, okay? And you can see that a lot of it, they're coming in through Mexico, right? And they're pushing up and getting into the U.S. via the southern borders. So, you have to kind of figure out how do we mitigate that? Okay, so we spent some time now talking about these transnational groups, etc., and now we're going to move into terrorism. And this will be the last part of our lecture. So here is kind of a unique opportunity for you. This was put together by a Redlands-based company that kind of walks you through the actual incident that happened in San Bernardino. So you can click on this link and it'll take you to kind of a storybook where it'll walk you through the entire incident. It's got photos, video, and audio. So you can get a better idea of actually what happened in that particular incident. Now, although terrorism is sometimes viewed as a kind of a contemporary phenomenon, terrorism and terrorists have been around for a long time. The first terrorist activities were committed by members of minority religious groups who engaged in violence to, gain the right to practice their own forms of religion, establish the supremacy of their own religion over others, or meet the requirements of, the gods that they basically worship. Now, that was quite some time ago. But the term terrorist first appeared at the time of the French Revolution, where Edmund Burke, a noted, British political philosopher, referred to the violence he observed in Paris as the Reign of Terror. And terror was also associated with the unrest in Russia that led to the 1917 Bolshevik takeover. So, we kind of know where some of the words come from. But as a result, as we kind of fast forward, right, the events of 9/11 basically added a new dimension to policing in the U.S. And experience now tells us that the first responders to any future terrorist incident will most likely be police, fire, and rescue, and more than likely police first. And as a result, law enforcement officials have to figure out strategically and kind of rethink their security procedures and how do they respond to these things. When you go to this particular website right here and you walk through this, you're going to think about what you would do if you were, responding to these types of things. And, completed and attempted terrorist attacks present a significant, difficult challenge for law enforcement and are going to require new levels of cooperation between agencies, communication, and even information sharing. Because typically law enforcement, we're not that good at sharing information sometimes with other agencies. And as I said before, the term terrorism first appeared, in the French Revolution with Edmund Burke, when he, kind of observed, at Paris, the Reign of Terror. And when I talked about the fact that terror was associated with the unrest in Russia that led to the 1917 Bolshevik takeover. And terror had also been associated with the Civil War in Ireland and the Irish Republican Army, which is considered to be the model for a lot of different terrorist organizations. And because of its complexity, an all-encompassing definition of terrorism is sometimes hard to formulate. According to the U.S. State Department, the term terrorism means premeditated, meaning they thought about it, right? Politically motivated violence that is carried out or perpetrated by subnational groups or clandestine agents against non-combatants, not another army, usually intended to influence an audience. So, again, we have a lot of different terrorism definitions that are out there, right? And the definition used by the FBI in the Code of Federal Regulations has some of the same meanings or, kind of content, but it includes the unlawful use of force or violence against any persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political objectives. So we kind of see a couple of different definitions. And a third one, the 22nd U.S. Code defines terrorism as the premeditated, politically motivated violence carried out, perpetrated against non-combatant targets, citizens, by subnational groups or clandestine groups. So they all kind of overlap a little bit, but you do see politically motivated, you see political there, you see intimidate, coerce, and you see political here. So they all have a little bit. But most definitions of terrorism, okay, kind of include the systematic use of physical violence, either actual or threatened, against non-combatants to create a climate of fear and cause some religious, political, or even social change. Okay? So a lot to kind of think about with that. And part of what they do and the way that they do it is they fight basically in what they call an asymmetric kind of format, if you will, meaning it's not identical on both sides. Unconventional strategies and tactics adopted by a force when military capabilities of groups or powers are kind of unequal. Okay, but they're so significantly different that they can't make the same sort of attacks on each other. So that's why they do guerrilla tactics, right? They do hijackings, they do suicide bombing. So it's not a conventional thing, it's unconventional, right? Desert Storm in 1991 was the last conventional war fought by the U.S. In Iraq and Afghanistan and other troubled spots around the globe, the U.S. military is facing guerrilla warfare, also called asymmetric warfare. It's not the normal type of war that you see. It's things like this. It's, bombs or roadside bombs, IEDs that are hidden. And you can see a picture of one right here where it kind of looks like trash on the side of the road, but the electrical cords to detonate are over here. You have to use, the military brought in robots in order to clear some of the roadways, right? And they've got the little clasping mechanism at the front right here where they can basically, pick things up and they don't have to send people into that area, and it's got a camera and a detonating device and things like that. So this is the unconventional part. And then in addition to being unconventional, kind of, would be the use of sleeper cells. Those individuals or groups that stay hidden until they're called upon. And a sleeper cell for, let's say, a suicide bombing kind of looks like this. You have the bomber, the recon cell, the logistics cell. So the recon, they go out and they look at the area and do all the reconnaissance. These are the people that bring you the stuff logistically. The operations, they do the plan, and this is the bomber. And these guys aren't together. They're all separate in separate places, so in case they get caught, one won't compromise the other. Okay? And you can see, the kind of title to this article right here. We have also penetrated them with those who look like them. So they kind of hang out for years and years and years. Think of 9/11. And all the planning that went into that and how long it took, when they actually probably started, and how long those people that committed that crime were here in the U.S. before they actually did it, before they were called upon to do what they're going to do. So when you think of 9/11, you think of, car bombings in London. How long have these people been around? When you think of train bombings, they don't just fly over here and do this stuff, right, from a different country. They're typically here, even locally when you talk about, in the U.S., so the Boston bombing. So then what are some different types of terrorism? And we'll talk a little bit about that, international terrorism. This is a foreign-based or direct, kind of directed by countries or groups outside the United States against the United States. So again, foreign-based or directed by countries or groups outside the U.S. against the U.S. And that could be groups like, and here's some pictures, the Lebanese Hezbollah, Egyptian Al-Islamah, Palestine Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or Al-Qaeda. Okay, and when you look at some of these pictures in here, nowhere in here do you see peace, right? These are pretty photos of, guns and military looks and weapons and things like that, right? So these are some of the international terrorist groups that are actually out there. Well, if that's, international, what is domestic? Well, the FBI defines domestic terrorism as activities that involve acts dangerous to human life. That are a violation of criminal law of the U.S. or of any state and appear to be intended to intimidate or, coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. So kind of a long definition as it relates to the FBI, but basically domestic terrorism, they're based and operated in the U.S. as opposed to international outside of the U.S. And here, domestic without foreign direction, committed against persons or property, to intimidate or coerce a government or any civilian population or segment thereof. So it almost looks like the same definition of international, right? But it just isn't. International again means, outside of the country against this country. Domestic is in this country against this country. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And there are plenty of domestic groups. There's white supremacists, black supremacists, militia groups, right-wing extremists, pro-life extremists, animal rights activists, not all of them, okay, and even environmental extremists. But a lot of these can be, depending upon what they do, could be involved or defined as terrorist groups. And again, I'll give you the plug for AJ117 if you want to know a little bit more about terrorism. Okay, so with that being said, and we kind of know who the terrorists are, etc. Let's kind of look a little bit closer to home. There's something else we have to consider, would be the lone wolf offender or the lone wolf terrorist. So similar to international terrorism, domestic terrorism is often committed by a lone wolf, meaning one person, maybe two, but usually one. And it's usually a single person driven to hateful acts based on a particular set of beliefs. And in this particular case, we're looking at who? Who are we looking at? So, the Unabomber. Again, these are all different types of terrorists, etc. So, keeping with the theme, there's no real single personality trait or behavior pattern that distinguishes the majority of terrorists. There are some views on why terrorists engage in criminal activities. One is the psychological view. And according to this view, terrorist violence is not so much a political instrument as an end in itself. It is the kind of result of compulsion or, self-destructive urges. And then there's the socialization view, where the terrorists have been raised to hate their opponents, and they learn at an early age that they have been victimized by this oppressor. So that's just kind of like what they're fed, right? And if you look on page 645, not only does it define terrorists, but it talks about guerrilla warfare, what an insurgent is, and what a revolutionary is. And we'll get to those in just a minute. There's an ideological view, and these are terrorists that hold extreme ideological beliefs that prompt their behavior. At first, they have kind of perceptions of oppressive conditions, believing they are being victimized by some group or government. And then you have the alienation view. And these are basically terrorist operatives. They're not poor or lacking in education, and yet lack of economic opportunity and kind of recessionary economies are kind of correlated with terrorism. So those are just a couple of different views. And what are some of the methods that are used? Well, there's biological, chemical, nuclear agents, explosives and bombs, sometimes armed attacks, sometimes arson, sometimes technology. It really just kind of depends. We've seen all different types. Typically, you hear a lot about the suicide bomber, right? Um, and potential suicide terrorism may come from different backgrounds, the person, and different age groups, and maybe male or female. And most suicide terrorists believe the act makes them a martyr and really does ensure them kind of a place in heaven. So suicide bombing is an act in which a person personally delivers explosives and then detonates them to inflict the greatest possible damage, killing themselves or herself in the process. And they're particularly shocking on account of their kind of indiscriminate nature, clearly intending to kill or injure anyone within the range of the blast. And the victims being mostly unsuspecting civilians, right? And because of the, evident willingness of the bombers to die by their own hands. So, suicide bombings, and they're tough to detect too, right? And when you look at the effects of suicide bombings, when you kind of look at the effects of shrapnel, so this bomb was basically put together with a bunch of kind of screws and nuts. You can see those, so these metal, and you can see the damage that it can cause to somebody. And when you look at some of the different kind of tools that they use, this is kind of a diagram of a crude, basically suicide vest. And I'll show you a couple of others. One is here's what they call a kill switch. So they either push down on this or they pull the toggle to detonate the vest. And again, here's an actual vest that was taken apart, kind of crude, but you can see the nuts and the washers and the pieces of metal that look like actually bullets without the casing part, and nails. That's the shrapnel that will blast out from that vest. And it's actually pretty intense, right? So let's now look at some different types of terrorism, some contemporary types, right? Some different ones. So they have revolutionary terrorism that uses violence to frighten those in power and their supporters, and their goal is to replace the government. You have political terrorism directed at people or groups whom the terrorists live in close connection to, but who oppose the terrorist's political agenda or ideology, defined by the terrorists as outsiders, right, who we need to get rid of. There's nationalist terrorism that promotes the interests of a minority ethnic or religious group that believes it's been persecuted under the majority rule. You have retributive terrorism. Rather than fighting for a homeland, these terrorists fight for a cause. People who have this ideology or kind of religion conflict. State-sponsored terrorism occurs when a repressive government forces its people into obedience, oppresses minorities, and stifles political dissent. Cult terrorism basically kind of prove their followers, or the followers prove their loyalty through violence and intimidation. Destructive cults who resort to violence, including things like murder. You have criminal terrorism. A critical difference in approach exists when dealing with a terrorist and a street criminal. When fighting a terrorist, it's kill or be killed, not, capture, prosecute, and convict. So the idea in a terrorist is they're going to die, so they're just going to kill or be killed. For a criminal, they're more worried about capture, prosecution, and conviction. So there's different motivations, different objectives. A lot of times deadlier weapons seek to cause that wide-scale damage and fear factor. Look at the incident that happened in Las Vegas. I believe it was Mandalay Bay at kind of a country western concert. And don't get, you have to remember, terrorism is different than kind of an active shooter or a random shooter, right? So a little bit of a difference there. Remember the definition of terrorism. Then we have some other types. We have cyber terrorism that basically threatens to initiate the exploitation of or attack on computers. Agroterrorism, attack on agriculture. Bioterrorism that involves biological weapons of mass destruction, anthrax, botulism, smallpox. Eco-terrorism, acts of violence committed to support the ecological environmental causes. So there's a lot more than you think. Narco-terrorism refers to the use of terrorist attacks to support drug operations, basically to finance terrorism. So a lot of different things, right? You even have nuclear terrorism with more than 16,000 nuclear weapons worldwide, and given the fact that, the Islamic State groups already, have some low-grade nuclear material seized, from a facility in Mosul, many consider it well within the realm of possibility that this could fall into the hands of terrorists. So we have to think of all of this. And then we do know that part of the fight against terrorism is basically the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. On October 8th, 2001, then President George W. Bush signed Executive Order 13228, establishing the Department of Homeland Security. And you can see all of the agencies that fall down underneath it. Now, typically, the ones that you're going to know are going to be here. You have Customs and Border Protection, Immigration, the Coast Guard, Federal Emergency Management Agency, Customs Enforcement, Secret Service, and TSA. So these are the ones that typically are at the law enforcement level. Okay? And there are numerous laws that have been passed in an effort to catch terrorists and prevent acts of terrorism. Federal courts are typically the venue of choice. Remember back on October 26, 2001, then President George W. Bush signed into law the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism, or the Patriot Act, which gives law enforcement the ability to better search, detain, eavesdrop, etc. in pursuit of terrorists. And then when the Patriot Act expired in June of 2015, it was renamed or replaced by the USA Freedom Act. Okay, and this act restored in modified form many of the provisions that were originally listed in the Patriot Act, but it did kind of impose some limitations on, bulk data collection and telecommunications information and things like that. Okay, so kind of finishing up, note that terrorism falls into a couple of different categories, or convictions fall into one of two categories. Category 1 would be violations of federal statutes directly related to international terrorism, and that are utilized regularly in international terrorism matters. And then Category 2 cases include defendants charged with violating a variety of other statutes where the investigation involved in an identified link to international terrorism. The government has sometimes taken drastic measures to kind of curtail the rights of its enemies. In the wake of 9/11, the Supreme Court handed down several decisions in several, important cases. And a lot of these cases, again, kind of fell on the side of being able to, locate, identify, arrest, and prosecute terrorists, etc. So with that being said, what does the future hold then? So, what will criminal justice, be like a decade from now, 2 decades from now, a whole generation from now? How will crime itself evolve? What about offenders? Really the answer is kind of up in the air, right? History tells us much. In the mid-1990s, for example, several criminologists predicted a surge in serious crime, particularly among juveniles. But the last decade of the 20th century saw some of the largest crime drops in history, although we know that crime is kind of back up again, especially in the realm of terrorism. So a number of changes are kind of, predicted in the future. Demographic shifts. The population is aging. Over the next several decades, the number of people under age 18 in that population is going to shrink. And the over 65, population, however, will grow remarkably. There's going to be some more technology advances, right? Technology continues to advance at a very rapid pace, surveillance technologies, biometric tools, DNA analysis, just to name a few. Increased diversity. The number of foreign-born Americans really does continue to grow, and this diversity, though advantageous in many, many ways, will kind of exert pressure on the criminal justice system. So we just have to kind of look at all this. And there's some charts on page 652 and 653 that you can look at to kind of get a visual. Focus on what works. Evidence-based justice, features appear throughout this book. And this focus on what works and what doesn't is going to continue to gain some steam as taxpayers increase their efforts to hold the government accountable for what they're doing, right? Doing more with less. America's record debt is forcing cutbacks in government and some services, and the same is true of state and local governments. Globalization. One of the most significant trends in the future will be globalization, because boundaries will continue to be challenged and international criminal syndicates will continue to pose threats. And finally, illegal immigration. Continued immigration is certain to impact crime and criminal justice, though it's less certain what these effects will actually be. So just a lot of considerations for us to think about as we look at kind of, the changes in the future. So hopefully you were able to hang with me. I know that was a long lecture for part 2, but that's going to wrap up part 2 for chapter 16.